This is the Motherlands Podcast, a space for meaningful conversations surrounding women's reproductive health. Here, we strive to shed light on the complexities and nuances, offering perspective, insight, and a profound sense of connection. We aim to empower families through practical education and promoting health and vitality. I am your host, Keely Semler. This week's episode, I sit down with Katie Schubert from the Society of Women's Health Research to explore why women's health research continues to be underfunded compared to men's health and the crucial need to address this disparity. We discuss the importance of making research more inclusive, ensuring it reflects the diverse experiences of women from all races, ages, and socioeconomic backgrounds. The episode highlights the joint ethical responsibility of both the government and pharmaceutical companies to prioritize research on conditions that disproportionately affect women, such as endometriosis, PCOS, and maternal health. We also talk about the systemic power imbalance between the pharmaceutical industry, the government, and healthcare policy, calling for transparency and accountability to ensure that health outcomes are driven by the needs of women and not corporate interests. This episode underscores the urgent need for a compassionate and equitable approach to women's health, one that listens to and prioritizes women's voices, addresses long-term care needs, and ensures ethical research practices. It's a call to action for policymakers, healthcare providers, and society as a whole to come together and create a healthcare system that truly supports the well-being of women. There were some minor audio issues during the recording of this interview, but I hope the content is still clear and that you're able to follow along with the interview. Thank you so much. One of the most significant aspects of maternity care is the ability of individuals to achieve safe, informed, and positive birth experiences, even within complex healthcare systems. Many people enter the healthcare system with unquestioning trust, unaware that financial and institutional incentives may shape the recommendations they receive from their provider. Having supported clients both within and outside a hospital setting for nearly a decade, I have observed that those who engage in proactive preparation and self-advocacy are better positioned to navigate their care effectively. Establishing open, transparent communication with healthcare providers is essential to fostering a collaborative care environment, an approach that is critical regardless of the chosen birth setting. Motherlands is an educational platform with a focus on the public health and well-being of families. This is a place to come to your own conclusions about what matters most to you and your care through pregnancy, birth, postpartum, and beyond. We have done the work to sift through the data and research to give you the most succinct information to help aid you in your decision-making. We do not peddle our own agenda or ideology, and we respect the integrity of all people to choose what feels the most empowering to their individual body. Motherlands offers a multifaceted approach to learning, providing a library of research, tools, templates, and self-guided educational videos. We also offer live group lectures and discussions so that we can grow and learn from each other's experiences. We offer 2 learning paths. The Wayfarer track is self-guided, where you get access to an entire library and all supporting documents, and the Pilgrimage track, which includes everything from the Wayfarer, plus access to those live group lectures and discussions. This option lets you connect with other women who are looking for support and deeper understanding as they go through their pregnancy and birth journey. If you're interested, head over to wearemotherlands.com and use the code MOTHERLANDSPOD to get 20% off your enrollment. So for anyone who is listening who may not be familiar with the Society of Women's Health Research, can you explain its mission?
The Society for Women's Health Research was founded in 1990 on the idea that women were not being included in clinical research. They were being actively excluded from clinical research at the federal level and within the pharmaceutical industry. And so some researchers and clinicians got together and decided to create the organization to advocate for the inclusion of that population. And we did a really good job of it. There's a lot about making sure that there was a voice for this issue in Washington, D.C., but also seeing some pretty significant policy gains over the last 35 years has been really wonderful. But today, our mission is to advance women's health through science, policy, and education while promoting research on sex differences. And so the idea is that we can hopefully truly make women's health mainstream and put ourselves out of business, that no women's health gap exists, and we're doing the research that needs to be done to optimize the health of women.
I really appreciate you giving that overview. I think people have begun to acknowledge that there is a lack of funding in women's health research. I think people are sort of finally talking about that or willing to talk about that. Why do you think women's health research is consistently underfunded compared to research on men's health?
We see this quite a bit. I think there's a lot of concern about the women's health gap and this underfunding. I would even say deprioritization of women's health research. Number one, starting with what we mean when we use that phrase. So at the society, we think of women's health research really ranges from things like endometriosis and uterine fibroids through menopause and pregnancy, but it also includes cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's disease, obesity. So, really, anything that you can think of that would impact women is a women's health issue. Women were actively excluded in clinical research at the federal level up until 1993. So, in 1993, Congress passed the NIH Revitalization Act, which required NIH funded studies to include women. So, that was not that long ago and did require congressional action to mandate that inclusion.
And why were women consciously excluded from research?
The idea was that you were protecting women from research, right? Rather than through research, which is what we say now, that you need to really include women to make sure that you're fully understanding what's going on. But they were excluded because there was a fear that should a woman become pregnant, if you're a woman of reproductive age, you could become pregnant during a trial. And we weren't quite sure of the consequences of that for the mom or the fetus. And so it really was out of concern that women were excluded. There are ways to model data. There are ways to ensure that you can safely and effectively do this research in women of reproductive age. We obviously know that now. But I do think if you go all the way back into the 60s with thalidomide, which is usually used as an example of why we took such a turn in terms of including women, we had many, many women giving birth to babies with birth defects because they were given thalidomide for morning sickness, and it hadn't been tested in pregnant populations. We did know this to be true. Mostly in Europe, we were seeing this, but there were babies born in the US who experienced those birth defects. And so, sort of as a backlash to that, rightly so, right? We wanted to make sure that our science was telling us the right things, but really there was a blanket exclusion of women of reproductive age in all research, both at the federal level, but also through the pharmaceutical industry. But it really ended up as being the reason why we are seeing this lack of investment and, quite frankly, lack of information. So back then, researchers just thought of women as little men, that they could extrapolate their data out from information in men and then apply it to women. And obviously, we know that that's not true. But in areas where we see those differences between men and women, I think it's becoming even more clear. And then obviously, when you look at issues that uniquely impact women, we see a gap there in terms of investment and funding. I think over the last few years, we've seen a lot of traction in things like maternal health, looking at the rising maternal mortality rates, making more people aware of things like endometriosis, which really does impact about 10% of the women in this country. And that's about the same proportion of women who are impacted by diabetes. And so if you think about how we're describing these issues, I think there's been a lot more attention to it. But I think because of this exclusion, because of this idea that we thought we could just learn what we could from men and then we would extrapolate it out. And then, quite frankly, it was just less than 10 years ago that even female mice had to be included or considered in research. So, really thinking about male and female cells differently was something that researchers are still getting used to doing. And so, we are so far behind because of all of those things.
When I was in medical school and I was studying child and maternal health, I can't remember if I read it somewhere or if one of my professors talked about that the menstruation cycle was actually a confounding factor when it comes to clinical
Yeah.
trials. So that's what was disqualifying women, was the fact that we have this extra variable that men do not have. And instead of figuring out a way to incorporate that in, it just automatically disqualified women from the research. So this kind of brings up the next question I had to ask you, which is, what are the potential ethical implications of women's health being heavily influenced by pharmaceutical companies or by certain medication that is considered safe to take for women that have a vested interest in promoting medication rather than really understanding the biology of women?
I think because this has been ignored or because of this backlash that I mentioned surrounding thalidomide, right? I think the thought behind the exclusion was made coming from a place of it's more ethical to not do this research and include this population. And so the culture shift that I think we are seeing, we've seen it over the last 35 years, is to make sure that whatever population you're looking to treat with a particular medication or whatever population is mostly impacted by particular disease or condition, that is reflected in your trial population. And so I think we're seeing more being done there. But if you really think about it, you're obligated by ethics to do this research, right? Because otherwise you don't know sort of what the implications are on the back end. And we saw this in a variety of ways. We saw this, with Ambien, where women's dosage was totally off. And there were women taking a recommended dosage approved by the FDA of Ambien. And the consequences were they were, getting in cars and driving around and getting into car accidents. And that risk is, not something that you would want to take. So I think when you think about the ethics of all of this, there's both the level of investment and public interest that falls to, the pharmaceutical industry, but also the federal government and the research agencies to make sure that they're doing what they should be doing. But there's also these policy implications and levers that probably need to be pushed or pulled, if you will, to make sure that those things are happening. Because just because something's the right thing to do doesn't always mean that it's going to happen. I think, though, when you think about women's health, we've always made the argument it just makes good sense to do it.
Mm-hmm. What policies in particularly would you like to see passed in support of women's health research?
There are a few that we are looking at, and I will start with there are several over the last few years that have been really important that we would want to make sure we're building on. One of them has to do with sex differences and the sex is a biological variable policy, SABV. It just means that at the federal level within NIH and within the FDA, that researchers have to consider sex differences. We'd love to see that go a little bit further for more accountability. So, not just a consideration of it, right? Oh, I thought about it and I don't need to look at female mice because it's going to mess up my data or whatever, which is not an acceptable excuse, but you just have to say that you considered it. I'd love to see some accountability and analyzing the sex differences data. So I think there's a piece there. There's also a piece within the federal agencies to increase the funding across the board. That's really difficult during this current budget environment, but we did see the national academies come out late last year, and they found that about 8.8% of NIH funding goes to women's health research. Prior to that, we thought it was about 10.8%, so we are not moving in the right direction. We'd love to see that percentage increase. We'd love to see women's health research being better integrated across the National Institutes of Health and the FDA. But there's also issues surrounding how clinicians are being treated and how researchers are being educated. And there's some policy changes that could be made there to better incorporate women's health into medical school curriculum, sex differences into research curriculum to really get folks to understand what that means and why it's important. And it really just means, better targeting these therapies to people who need them. And I would say on the pharmaceutical side, we're watching really carefully because a lot of the breakthroughs that are outside of women's specific issues are found on secondary findings. And so if the pharmaceutical industry is not going to continue to invest beyond whatever indication they're initially looking for, there will be an implication for women's health down the line. And we're not sure what that means yet, but we are watching it very closely to make sure that we can keep thinking about what are those policy implications that we might need to engage in from an advocacy perspective.
Are you interested in becoming a women's reproductive health advocate? I'm excited to offer mentorship to women around the world who want more guidance and support on this important journey. This 6-month mentorship gives us the chance to work one-on-one, where I'll provide personalized tools and resources to help you empower and support other women while also taking care of yourself. This work is truly needed, and I'm here to help you every step of the way. You can find more details in the show notes, and my inbox is always open to connect with like-minded women who are ready to make a difference. So 2 further questions about funding. One is, of that small percentage of women's funding, how much of that is tied into pharmaceuticals contributing to that funding? Do you know?
So that's a good question. The 8.8% and the 10.8% was solely federal funding to the NIH. So that's what we are able to track. I don't have the exact data, although it would be very interesting to try to find this for where companies are investing. And there are some companies that only do women's health, and that's wonderful. What we would be looking for is, are you looking at sex differences? How are you thinking about women's health and research more broadly? But I will share that on the industry side, if you will, there's very high barriers to entry when you think about women's health. So we know that less than 2% of investments from venture capitalists into pharma for women's health, that less than 2% is so small. So I think it would be interesting to find that data too, because I don't know that we have a good sense of it. Just like those proportions within the NIH are still pretty small, and it's sort of like the best guess that we have on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things I teach clients that are pregnant and getting ready to have a family is, when they're looking at medical research, before even reading it, I try and invite them to skip all the way down to the bottom to see who funded that research paper, because a lot of research is funded by, organizations or companies that have an agenda, particularly pharmaceutical industry, which isn't all bad, I think. I think some of it is okay because they have the funding, right? But then it just brings into this ethical implication, like, can we trust the findings? Can we trust that if it's been funded, that research is actually true and unbiased? Do you have any thoughts on that?
We do rely a lot more on the federal side of research because it's not as lucrative to go into, or it's not seen as lucrative to go into women's health research. I think from my own personal perspective, my guess as to why that is that we're really thinking about issues that women have suffered in silence for so long, or they've been dismissed by clinicians. So the quote unquote problem is not seen as a quality of life issue or a truly impactful issue. I always use the example of things like endometriosis and uterine fibroids and menopause symptoms. They're not going to kill you. They can be very disruptive. You may not be able to work if you have these. You may suffer with pain for many, many years. But when you think about, like, quote unquote, life-saving therapies, like, those are not areas of investment that are seen as exciting, right? Like, it's not like curing cancer, right? Which is super, super exciting. So I feel like in addition to the issues surrounding what is the data telling you, what are the questions people have to ask about the data, which we would recommend in any setting, right? Make sure, you fully understand what was the question that was trying to be answered in a particular trial. I would love to see, because I think there's value in this, what about trials that don't pan out the way that, like, aren't quote unquote successful, right? Wouldn't you want to know what information you learned from those? And those are not largely on either side, right? Through industry or the federal government. Like, those results are not necessarily published. And so really thinking about, is there reproducibility? What are the questions that were asked? Where was the research conducted? And then very importantly, what was the population that was included in this research? Are you only looking at white women? Are you only looking at women in rural areas or in urban? The social determinants of health are really, really important. And I mentioned maternal mortality earlier. Like, we know Black women are 3 times more likely to die of a pregnancy related complication than white women. And that's regardless of socioeconomic status. So there are things happening here that we need to investigate. So unfortunately, what that means for us as patients is, like, we have to be very literate in our health, right? And we have to make sure that we're fully understanding what was it that went into this study and how many studies have found this. What does the literature say? That can be really difficult, particularly for women who are really busy, are caregiving for others and maybe not putting their health first. And that also leads into, like, clinicians, if you're prescribing anything or you're engaging in shared decision making with patients, to really also ask those questions, really take the time to do that, because I think that's something that we are maybe missing a little bit of through sort of the healthcare system is really that discernment and what does this mean? And science changes. We know that it is evolving. And so something that might have been successful 20 years ago may not be the right option now.
So you mentioned industry and federal levels being involved in women's health research and the funding of women's health research or health research in general. What about like private entities? Does the society, collaborate with private people to perhaps fund research or get them involved in some way?
We would love to be able to do more of that. I think that there is an opportunity for some of the philanthropic foundations to fund areas of research that maybe the federal government or the pharmaceutical industry has decided is not necessarily, as lucrative or worth investing in. So I think there is an obligation of folks who are able to fund this to do so. And so what we try to do is gather the experts to share where we see these gaps. And actually, we just published just recently a research agenda that identified a few areas where we think if there were to be investment, we could make some big change. And it's, in metabolic, it's in uterine fibroids. From a perspective of women's health, the opportunities really are endless. And I think there is a return on investment there, because if we can invest earlier and understand what's happening, women will be healthier. Trying to connect people from a patient perspective right now, we need as much investment as possible wherever that comes from. And we need new ideas and we need to share ideas so that we can make as much progress as possible.
That's so helpful. So, are there ways for anyone that's listening, like a mom that's breastfeeding on her couch right now, to get involved with the Society of Women's Health Research?
Yes. Oh my gosh. Amazing. You just gave me a little flashback. I used to go to Dr. Google while I was breastfeeding in the middle of the
Oh
night.
boy, I'm sure
So,
that made you
as they're
feel
listening to
nice and comfortable.
podcasts, there are many ways to get involved. So, number one, we have many resources available for people in a variety of ways, both in terms of education on healthcare topics. I have not yet mentioned autoimmune conditions, but 80% of autoimmune patients are women. And so we have a lupus toolkit, we have some autoimmune policy toolkits. On the uterine health side, we have endometriosis and uterine fibroids. We're working on some PCOS materials as we speak. And then we also have opportunities, sort of as folks age, particularly for women who are in their early stages of motherhood or thinking about starting a family, or maybe they've just finished having babies. That doesn't mean that your engagement with the healthcare system ends. We want to make sure that women are continuing to be empowered in their healthcare and to remember that whatever happens during your pregnancy, health wise, may have implications later on. So, really making sure that women are equipped. So, our website is swhr.org. You can sign up for our newsletters. You can peruse all of our health areas of focus. And then there's always opportunities to share your story. And it doesn't have to be research specific, it can just be sharing your story to help empower others. We like to do that in a variety of ways. We have so many areas that we're looking at right now. So if you don't see whatever is the concern that you are having or what you have experienced, share it with us so that we can make sure that we add it as well. There's lots of opportunities there.
That's brilliant. Is there anything else that you feel called to share just about what the society is doing or what you're curious or interested about as research evolves and hopefully expands in women's health research?
I think I am really excited to see the momentum that women's health and women's health research has had over the last few years in particular. So many more people are talking about it nationally. So many more women are feeling less stigmatized to be able to share what they're experiencing. This may be my age to perimenopause now, and really leaning on one another to be able to say, oh, that's not what I'm experiencing. And maybe you might need to, check in with a healthcare professional, or, oh, yes, I have that too. And what are we going to do about it? Also intergenerationally to have these conversations. So I feel like that's number one. That's super exciting. What I want to make sure that people keep in mind and stay motivated about is turning that momentum into a movement. So people may be feeling discouraged or like they aren't being listened to, or that this is maybe not the time to engage in this empowerment effort surrounding women's health. And I think that's all the more reason for us to remain vigilant in this space. And so engaging in whatever level, whether that's policy advocacy or, at your community level, and just having these conversations, I think is going to be really critical to see what's going to happen over the next few years. Sort of my vision would be that we would see closing this gender health gap in our lifetime versus in 35 years, are we still in the same place that we are today? I don't think we will be, but I think there are ways for us to accelerate that. So I feel like those are two really big things for us to make sure that women as a whole are able to really take charge of this topic and engage in whatever level and way that they feel comfortable. And then I think the last thing I would say is I was just reading an article that women are living longer, which we know to be true, but our health span is shorter than men's. So the years in which we are healthy is smaller than our actual life, and it's smaller than men's health span. And so I really want people to think about that, and for women to think about, how do we live well as long as possible? And what are the ways that I can take good care of myself so that I can be here for my family, for myself, for my career, whatever the areas are that you care about. I think that's a really good way for us to be thinking about it. Like, it's not just for the sake of being as young as possible for as long as possible. This is really about longevity and mobility and health and well-being across our lifespan than anything else.
I so appreciate that, because I think it's easy to sit back and go, this problem is just so much bigger than something I can solve on my own. And I work one-on-one with clients and with patients, both in clinical settings and outside of clinical settings. And it can be exhausting and a little disheartening just seeing and witnessing things happening. However, when you take a step back and you realize we can all contribute here and we all just need to be very focused together, I think that's when real change can occur. And like you said, the more people are educated of what's going on, what their options are, what's really happening, I think that's a good entry point into becoming motivated enough to make decisions and to take action and to get involved. So I think that's a really beautiful way of putting it.
Thank you. I mean, I think that's right. It's not just up to one person. I really feel like, and maybe this is the former lobbyist in me. So full disclosure, I for a very long time was a registered lobbyist in the maternal health space. But I really do think that these things will change with a groundswell, and it's going to be at multiple levels, and we are right on the cusp of it. So we have to just stay really focused on it and know that we really truly are all in this together. And what we do now is not only going to help us, but it's going to help future generations to remain as healthy as possible and to shine a light on what we're seeing and to actually close that gender health gap.
The conversation isn't over yet. We've still got about 15 minutes of this episode, but it's behind a paywall. If you'd like to hear the rest of it and show your support for the show, a paid subscription makes all the difference. Your support helps me cover the cost of paying my editor, providing for my family, and managing all the day-to-day expenses that make this work possible. As a paid subscriber, you'll also get access to a full extended episode plus bonus content where I share my personal reflections as a doula, midwife assistant, and a women's reproductive health educator. I talk openly about the emotional richness of this work, the art of caregiving, and share simple meditative practices to help you find calm, confidence, things I believe are valuable for all of us. Your subscription truly supports the continued growth of the podcast and the time I can dedicate to producing it. If you're unable to subscribe right now, there are still plenty of ways to support the show. You can leave a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, subscribe to our Substack, follow us on YouTube, or simply share the show with friends and family who might enjoy it. In addition to producing this podcast, I am a full-time birth doula, educator, and mentor. Your support, in whatever form it takes, helps me to continue this important work and share it with you. Thank you so much for being a part of this community, and your encouragement means the world to me. Thank you so much.